Thank you for the gift of being able to speak to you this morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Then Jesus also said, the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise all day, all night, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. My sons and I share a common interest in films. On long drives, out of dinner, or most any time at all, our conversation often turns to a remembered quote from a movie. Invariably, it's from a scene like My Cousin Vinny, starring Danny DeVito, or Tin Men, where DeVito teams up with Richard Dreyfuss. You remember Tin Men, the 1987 film about aluminum siding salesman in Baltimore? We've almost memorized that film. Any mention of one of those lines leaves us breaking into literally uncontrollable laughter. There's a scene in Tin Men where salesman Sam tells us he is inspired to come to a closer relationship with God. He recalls a smorgasbord with his wife, and he reports, I'm beginning to believe in God. I'm looking at all this food. I see all these vegetables, and I think, all these things come out of the ground. I see tomatoes out of the ground, carrots out of the ground, radishes out of the ground. And I think all of these things come out of the ground. And I'm just talking about the vegetables. I haven't even gotten the fruit yet. And I think, how can that be? How can all these things come out of the ground? With all these things coming out of the ground, there must be a God. This morning in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus speaks to his disciples about the parable of the seed. These verses this morning are actually the conclusion of a three-part parable describing the mystery of the kingdom of God. You recall how the parable begins. Just a few verses earlier, Jesus speaks to an eager crowd along the shores of Galilee. He describes the sower as he casts seeds purposely and extravagantly upon the earth. Some falls along a path where the birds eat it up. Some falls on rocky places where it springs up quickly, but just doesn't take hold in the thin soil. Some falls among the thorns, where it's choked and fails to bear grain. Still other seed falls on good soil. There it flourishes. It produces an extravagant crop. Some multiply 30, some 60, sometimes 100-fold. The image of the farmer sowing in biblical Israel would be so familiar to that agricultural society. There might have even been a farmer sowing kernels in wheat or barley in a field nearby while Jesus speaks to that crowd. The farmers in that audience would have known and expected an average yield of, say, tenfold. So the end of the story that Jesus tells would have been a stunner for Jesus' audience when he describes the abundant, the amazing yield of the kingdom of God. Yet his disciples fail to understand the parable of the sower. Speaking in parables is an expression of grace that allows the hearer time for reflection. Had Jesus spoken his message directly to the crowd, he would have risked, they would have been led, if you will, to an immediate decision or immediate conclusion, which would likely have been rejection or unbelief. So in a rare circumstance, Jesus takes the disciples aside and explains. He describes how God's kingdom is spread as a seed. It takes root and flourishes. where there are ears to hear. In speaking to his disciples this morning, Jesus gives them ears to hear. And like salesman Sam, no one knows how the seed comes into maturity, either as grain, fruit, or vegetable. So this morning, Jesus tells us the parable of the secret growth of the seed and the extravagance of its bounty, and the example of the mustard seed. The kingdom of God, Jesus says, is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus explains further. Now, the parable is this: the seed is the word of God. Jesus proclaims that the kingdom has been sown in this manner all through the world, in the midst of every human and earthly condition. It's sown everywhere, no matter what the quality of the soil or the weeds that may grow among them. And then the sower goes on about his business. He sleeps and rises every day. The seed sprouts. The sower doesn't know how. It grows by itself in its own good time, but we know not how. Perhaps you recall the children's story of Frog and Toad together. Toad sees Frog's beautiful garden and decides he too wants a garden. Frog warns him, "A garden is hard work, Toad." He then gives Toad flower seeds to plant. Toad plants the seeds and tells them to start growing. They fail to grow immediately, so Toad shouts to the ground, "Seeds, grow!" Frog says that Toad is frightening the weeds. "Leave the seeds alone, Toad." The seeds don't grow that evening either. So Toad thinks they are afraid of the dark. He sings to them, he plays music to them, he reads poems to them, and then he falls asleep. He wakes in the morning and sees the seeds have begun to sprout at last, little shoots coming out of the ground. Finally happy that the seeds are no longer afraid to grow, Toad tells Frog, "You're right, Frog. Growing a garden is very hard work." At the time of our creation, we were planted as a seed in the divine image of our Creator. Our seed fails to grow immediately. Looking back over the ages, I suspect God would have agreed with Toad that growing a garden is hard work. I think God would also agree with the lyrics of country song Catherine Mattea as follows. "Sometimes I stop on my way home and watch the children play. And I wonder if they wonder what they'll be someday. Some will dream a big dream and make it all come true, while others go on dreaming of things they'll never do. We're all just seeds in God's hand. We start the same, but where we land is sometimes fertile soil and sometimes sand. We're all just seeds in God's hand. We're all just seeds in God's hand." But as with the parable, we must be prepared to receive the seed that is planted. We must be prepared to receive and to understand. Jesus is not just announcing to his audience that God's kingdom is now here present. He's announcing that God's kingdom is present only if and when is it accepted, entered into, and taken upon oneself. Return with me then to another scene in the film Tin Man. Salesman Tilly is down on his luck. His sales cams aren't working any longer. The Baltimore Home Improvement Commission and the IRS are hard on his heels. At the salad bar, he looks down on the luscious tomatoes, the inviting vegetables, and in that moment, Tilly remembers. He acknowledges God's presence as Tilly prays that God will help him in his time of trouble. The seed of the kingdom has begun to germinate in Tilly. The miracle of the seed is that it's so tiny. It's buried deep in the earth. It's covered over and never seen as a seed again. It's nourished by the warmth and the moisture that surrounds it. As we come into flower, we call upon our Creator, the one who has sown us, to bring us into the kingdom of God. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Just as the mustard seed grows from its tiniest beginning, the sower calls us to flower into her divine image. Come home to me now. Grow to become the greatest of all shrubs. Set forth your large branches, so that the birds of the air, those whom I have called you to love, the forgotten, the homeless, the refugee, the poor of spirit, can find rest in your shade.